Modern systemic control doesn't operate through visible chains. It's a highly engineered, totally invisible architecture. This blueprint maps exactly how power sustains itself in the late capitalist era, and it exposes a very specific mechanical dynamic between manufactured consensus and punitive coercion, used to manage, isolate, and completely neutralize dissent.
This forces us to immediately evaluate the structural integrity of our daily lives. Think about it. Is the tranquility we observe in modern society a reflection of genuine organic harmony, or are we simply witnessing a highly effective armed truce, where everyday compliance is maintained strictly by the overarching threat of economic destitution and structural violence?
Section 1. Blueprint of Systemic Control, the Mechanics of Plutocratic Coercion. Okay, let's dive into this.
Consider the stark reality of how this operates. Stomp it, it's lights out. The ones that write the checks will break the necks to silence any opposition. That strips away all the technocratic euphemisms, right? It anchors the foundational premise that financial power inherently relies on physical suppression. The people writing the checks are intrinsically linked to the brutality required to protect those checks. Economic hegemony and state violence, they're literally two sides of the exact same coin.
We're talking about plutocratic coercion. Domination here isn't just a police baton. It's an entire closed-loop system. It relies heavily on structural precarity, the deliberate denial of a basic, reliable livelihood to keep a population desperate and compliant. It uses legal asphyxiation, deploying massive financial resources to bankrupt any opposition through the courts. And of course, when the legitimacy of that system fractures, it pivots instantly to privatized, punitive violence.
What's absolutely crucial to understand here is how governance structures manage dissent not just through direct punishment, but through deliberate spatial asymmetry. Space itself becomes an active instrument of control. You have a hegemonic core where capital investment and authorized dialogue are heavily concentrated. And then you have the segregated periphery, hyper-ghettoization, resource deficits, and a purely penal apparatus.
Whether we resist it with or without the violence, they're always going to keep us on our own desert island. That perfectly illustrates the concept of advanced marginality. It highlights a profound structural impotence. Regardless of the tactical choice between peaceful or violent resistance, the overarching system is designed to trap non-assimilated populations in a state of total geographic and symbolic isolation.
This desert island isn't a metaphor. We're looking at biopolitical insularity. It operates as a literal mechanism of civic death. By cutting off peripheral populations from strategic infrastructure and political traction, ideological contagion is completely neutralized. You don't actually need to arrest dissidents if you can just confine them to a geographic quarantine zone where their voices physically cannot breach the walls of the productive city.
Section 2. The Psychological Attrition, Grinding the Internal Gears. Let's shift our focus inward to the psychological toll this machine exacts.
I'm in the back because I don't want to see anyone. I'm fucked up and wondering where the love gone. That is the physical, somatic response to a chronically hostile environment. It's biological withdrawal. When the brain interprets its surroundings as persistently destructive, it activates a profound, involuntary defense mechanism. Retreating to the back isn't mere sadness. It's a desperate attempt by the nervous system to conserve baseline biological resources.
Let's move through this and see how it builds mechanically. It always begins with intergenerational neglect and childhood adversity. As the environment remains hostile, the nervous system triggers a dorsal vagal shutdown response, literally immobilizing the social self. This leads directly to dopaminergic exhaustion, a total inability to feel pleasure, or anhedonia. Finally, the prefrontal cortex, our logic and control center, simply burns out under the chronic stress, leading to a complete inhibitory collapse and a massive loss of behavioral restraints.
But right before that final collapse, we often see a massive psychological overcompensation. Protect the house and feed the mouths the way I was never fed. Individuals adopt the archetype of the absolute guardian. By desperately trying to provide the security and nourishment they were structurally denied, they're essentially attempting to retroactively heal their own primary wounds. But doing so requires maintaining a state of constant, incredibly exhausting hypervigilance. The biological cost of maintaining that allostatic high alert is staggering. Statistically, only about 35% of individuals subjected to severe trauma manage to forge an earned secure attachment. The vast majority, 65%, remain trapped in unresolved cycles. This proves that resilience isn't just some innate magical trait. It's an incredibly resource-intensive process that systemic precarity actively, purposefully sabotages.
Section 3.
myth-busting the peaceful consensus.
Let's dismantle the most pervasive socio-political myth we have that nonviolence succeeds purely in isolation through some inherent moral superiority. The mechanical reality is that institutional concessions are almost always forced by the radical flank effect, meaning peaceful resistance is systematically absorbed and ignored by power structures unless it is backed by a radical faction that poses a very credible threat of direct material disruption.
So the crucial point is this. Apathy is actually an imposed construction designed to artificially raise the cost of rebellion. We're taught to view social withdrawal and anhedonia as moral apathy or just passive laziness. But functionally, in reality, defensive withdrawal is a biological conservation strategy. When the prefrontal cortex is totally exhausted from managing constant structural friction, the brain shuts down its social engagement system simply to survive.
Likewise, spatial segregation is not some accidental outcome of a free market real estate dynamic. Geographic marginality is meticulously planned. Redlining, hostile architecture, and the surgical withdrawal of essential public services are deliberately engineered biopolitical boundaries used to contain non-assimilated populations.
Section 4. Mechanics of tactical escalation. Let's pivot to the systemic failure point.
I see everybody screaming, "Fuck this" and "fuck that." Well, now it's time to do something about it. Something violent. This marks the exact moment the threshold of containment breaks. In a system operating under oppressive tolerance, people are allowed to vent because it acts as a pressure valve that changes absolutely nothing. But passive frustration inevitably transitions here, when the subject realizes discursive dissent is materially useless and kinetic action becomes the only functional tool left.
And this brilliantly illustrates the three-step mechanical progression. Step 1, the collapse of legitimacy, where institutional dialogue completely fails. Step 2, the hidden script, where covert, everyday resistance starts building under the surface. And Step 3, emancipatory counterviolence. When the system's objective violence becomes existential, the reaction boils over into tactical, direct disruption. It isn't irrational vandalism, it is a highly rational, predictable escalation.
In the back, masked up with the trench on. In the back, masked up with my day ones. When that escalation occurs, it requires specific psychosocial defense technologies. The mask and the trench coat aren't just aesthetic choices. They are functional tools of algorithmic evasion. Standing in the back with your day ones refers to the highly cohesive cellular structure of affinity groups, which is the absolute basic organizational unit required to survive in a high-friction, heavily surveilled environment. These tactics of asymmetric insurgency are brilliant defenses against the biometric surveillance state. Small affinity groups of 3 to 12 trusted nodes offer virtually total immunity to external intelligence infiltration. The mask defeats algorithmic counter-surveillance while simultaneously triggering de-individuation, aligning the individual perfectly with the collective objective. But executing this requires an epistemological purge, a complete mental reset, discarding the institutional dogmas that previously demanded polite obedience.
Section 5, the unavoidable consequence. Let's synthesize the real-world outcomes of this entire machine.
The system forces an absolute binary, total compliance or tactical disruption. When economic hegemony explicitly dictates the boundaries of legality just to protect its own profit margins, the middle ground is completely eradicated. If the baseline machinery of the state constitutes structural violence, passive action is literally just compliance. Strategic otherness and perceptual disruption become your only functional tools. So consider this final thought experiment. If your identity, your aesthetics, and your obedience are perfectly mapped by the exact same surveillance architecture that is exploiting you, when does erasing yourself from the grid become your only genuine act of sovereignty?